Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Maureen O'Connor from Quilters Heaven in Northbrook, Illinois, and I am the Opinionated Quilter. Today's episode, number 102, is Make It Smaller. No opinion today, let's get right to the episode. I'm a big Lori Holt fan, and when a customer brought this pattern into the store, I knew I had to make this witch. But I looked at the size of the quilt and it was ginormous. I'm just not interested in making huge quilts anymore. In fact, since I've already made a table topper and table runners for every single holiday and season, I've now moved on to little wall hangings and door banners. And I thought this witch would make the perfect little wall hanging. So I made her. Here she is. And it is half the size of the original pattern. The witch is half the size. The quilt is not exactly because of the change that I made in it. But I want to go through the math with you. I'm not going to do every single block. We've done quilters math before. I do want to just do a review. So let's get to the math. If you've watched my channel before, you know the mantra is do the math without the seam allowance and then add it back in at the end. So I'm just going to give you two examples here. If you're making something half the size, you take what they tell you to originally cut. So if they told you to cut 4.5 by 6.5, you take the 4.5, take off the half, get to 4, divide by 2, you get 2. Now you have to add the half back in, so it's 2.5. You do the same thing with the 6. 6.5 minus a half is 6, divided by 2 is 3, plus a half is 3.5. So if in the pattern it told me to cut 4.5 by 6.5, I'm cutting 2.5 by 3.5. Let's just do one more. Because these I look at and I can see immediately. Some I still have to really do the math. If we look at something that would tell you to cut 2.5 by 11.5, you would take the 2.5, minus a half equals 2, divided by 2 is 1, plus a half is 1.5. 11.5 becomes 11.5 minus a half equals 11, divided by 2 equals 5.5, plus a half is 6. So if it said cut 2.5 by 11.5, and I'm making mine 50% smaller, I would cut 1.5 by 6. So my quilt ended up here. This is without borders. I am going to put borders on it, but right now it's 30 by 36.5. The pattern quilt was 76.5 by 89.5. I said earlier I don't want to make giant quilts, but the other thing is too, what would you do with a Halloween giant quilt? Do you put it on your bed for a week? Please drop in the comments if you have, say, Patty's Day quilt, Valentine's Day quilt that are this big. How often do you use them and how do you use them? Because I can't think of what I would do with this size Halloween quilt. Now there's a couple other things in this quilt that required a little bit more math than just cutting pieces. And if you look at it here, there's little flying geese here in the broom, and there is this star on the witch's blouse. So let me switch out the whiteboard and we'll go over that math. To make the flying geese for the broom handle, you first have to determine what size the flying geese are in the original quilt. So I looked at the pattern and it said to cut 2-inch by 3.5-inch rectangles. Clearly, they're making the flying geese using a rectangle and 2 squares method, which I don't like because it wastes fabric. Although, as small as I was making them, you're not wasting a whole lot. I just like the fast flying geese method of 1 large square and 4 smaller squares to make 4 flying geese. So once I see 2 by 3.5, I know what size flying geese I'm trying to make. I take the 2, I minus the half, equals 1.5, divided by 2 is 3/4. The 3.5 minus a half is 3, divided by 2 is 1.5. So I know that my flying geese are going to be 3/4 by 1.5. And you know that's right because the width is always twice the height. 3/4 and 3/4 is 1.5. So I know that's the correct size. So what can I use to make that? I get out my wing clipper 2 ruler, and if you look in this upper right hand corner, you can see that it says 1.25 by 2 right up here. So 3/4 plus a half is 1.25, and 1.5 plus a half is 2. So I know that that's the correct unfinished size for the 3/4 by a half finished that I want. Since I've had this ruler, Deb has come out with a pint size wing clipper, and that also has this measurement on it. So either one will work. The wing clipper 2 or the pint size wing clipper will get you the numbers you need to make that size flying geese. Now, the pattern calls for 10. The fast flying geese method is 4 at a time. So I had to make 3 sets. So I have 2 flying geese left over. So while I don't like to waste, it's just a little bit of a waste to get perfectly accurate, tiny flying geese. That waste is worth it to me. And that's just a decision you have to make for yourself. The next thing I altered in the pattern is the star in the blouse. And when I wrote this board, I accidentally put in the numbers that were the original pattern. So I've crossed them out here. So the center of the star block is a square and a square unit, which was originally 4 inches. Mine needs to finish to 2 inches because it's obviously half of that. The star points were a 4 by 3 inch block. And it's essentially constructed the same way, doing the Deb Tucker way, as the way in the book. The advantage of why I like the Deb Tucker way is you then use your squared ruler to trim. You oversize it a little bit, you trim, and you get perfect units with the top point of the square in the right spot with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So the technique that Deb uses is her little houses technique sheet. And that comes to squares, not something like this that was a 4 by 3. I need to make mine 2 by 1.5, 50% smaller. So what I did with the little houses is this should be crossed off and also a 2 like it is up here. So this is 2 inch finished. So I make my little houses 2 inch finished, and then after I trim this to make sure that this is correct with my wing clipper not my wing clipper ruler, with my square and a square ruler, I trim off the excess to make this 1.5 instead of 2-inch finished. So that's how I did the math for this. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is this pattern. Picking the fabrics for it was so much fun, and on the hunt in my scrap pile for the exact right fabric. And to me, all I could think of was, please don't buy the kit for this. There's so many other choices. You buy the kit for this, you're making Lori Holt's quilt. And I love the pattern. Don't get me wrong. I love the pattern, and I like a lot of Lori Holt's designs. Let's look at some of the fabric choices of what you can do when you go through your scrap pile and pick your own fabrics. Let's start down at the bottom. This is a purple fairy frost. I say she's got purple patent leather boots on. How fun is that? Now, I did try taking my scrap squares and just putting them in random order, and it just didn't work for me. There's only 4 basic colors: the purple, the green, the orange, and the black, and I couldn't get the distribution good. And I've said this before, that sometimes if you can't get a random distribution, switch to trying a pattern, and that sometimes works better. And that's what I did here. Row of purple, green, orange, black, and repeat. The one super fun thing I did was I had a Halloween fabric that had purple bats on an orange background, and I stuck the purple bat on the bottom row of the skirt. This is something that nobody else is ever going to have exactly like this. They may have this fabric and they may put it somewhere, but it's not going to be exactly the same. I did use the fairy frost down here just for one solid row in the pattern. These are all the individual squares. I chose to go a different route. In my scrap pile, I've used this stripe for a binding, and whenever I use a stripe for binding, I always have a large triangle left over. Because if you cut a very small piece of a stripe and then cut bias strips, you have so many joins. So I always like to get at least 3/4 of a yard of fabric if I'm going to cut bias strips, so that I can get a long enough strip and don't have to piece a zillion little strips together. So and I was very careful here to cut these in the same spot. So you can see it starts with the little green at the top, and then it's the same all the way down to the little tiny little green in the tip. I loved this grunge fabric I used for the star points, because it has the orange. The grunge is double dyed. It always has a second color in it. And this has the orange and then a more redder orange here. And this redder orange is in this stripe as well. So there's the regular orange and the more red orange. Another fabric we loved picking, and actually Linda, who you've seen before picking fabric, picked this one out. And this is what we picked for the hair. How much more fun is that than a solid coppery color? I just think it gives so much movement to the hair. I then, instead of using green for the trim on the hat, I picked back up on the boots. So this is the same fairy frost, and that was a scrap. That was a leftover from a back of a quilt we had done. So there's so many fun choices. The broom handle, the metal clip you need this tiny, tiny little piece. I'm sure you can find something in your scrap pile to be that. They use a platinum color, I think, in the original pattern. But the fabric choices, we were so excited picking these fabrics that if you buy a kit, you lose that whole joy and of putting a one-of-a-kind together. That's why I don't want to say I'm anti-kits, because sometimes if you want to do something fast and you don't want to do the thinking and you just got to get it done, it works. So when it works for you, do it. But if you have scraps you want to use, this is the way to go. Last thing before I go, real quick, you really enjoyed the episode with Linda picking fabrics. I want to show you the couple things we auditioned for the borders and what we decided on. This was one fabric that was pulled for a border, and we decided it was just too much. It was too strong. Anybody guess why we rejected this? I love this fabric. It's got, again, the same two colors over here, the orange and the redder orange. It's bright. It's too bright for this witch. What we ended up deciding on is a tiny little border of this, which has the orange and the redder orange in it. And then this chalk and charcoal as a smaller outer border. And see how much more dull this chalk and charcoal is than this one we originally considered. So have fun choosing your fabrics. Don't give that to somebody else. You've got all those scraps. Everybody wants to use your scraps. Now, I can't say this made a dent in my scrap pile, because it didn't. But what it did do was gave me great joy in pulling things from the scrap pile and using them and putting together such a fun quilt. I do highly recommend her patterns. She's got, Lori Holt, has Farm Girl Vintage 1 and 2. And she also has this Vintage Christmas, which I've quilted for customers a couple times. And people did really fun things in here, putting like a snowman in a door, or, you know, all kinds of different fun things that, like I did with the bat here, people have done with others of her patterns. So consider doing a door banner or a wall quilt, little wall hanging, as opposed to a giant quilt if you like the pattern. So that's today's episode. Please like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, happy sewing.